New Orleans in 1918 did not feel like a city in the United States. It breathed differently, moved differently, pulsed with a rhythm that felt older than the country around it. The humidity clung to everything like a living skin. The scent of old wood, river water, sweat, and spices hung in the air. Even at night the warmth stayed heavy, drifting down the narrow alleys between shotgun houses and Creole cottages. People walked slower in that heat, spoke softer, listened more, and in that stillness unspoken, subtle, familiar something else listened too. The first sign that terror had arrived came quietly, long before the newspapers caught its scent, long before the city realized it was being watched. A scream broke the dawn on a spring morning, sharp enough to cut through the thick air. Neighbors spilled out of their homes in robes and nightgowns, blinking into the sunlight as if waking from a dream. Inside the small grocery store on the corner of Upper Line Street, the floor was slick with blood. Joseph Maggio, a grocer known for his gentle manner and his skill with making Italian wine, lay on his bed with his throat cut wide open. His wife, Catherine, lay beside him, still breathing when neighbors found her but only barely. A deep wound carved across her skull exposed bone. She lived long enough to slip into a brief moment of awareness, whispering sounds that no one could understand, before dying in the arms of a neighbor woman who prayed over her until her eyes dimmed. The police arrived, confused and sluggish, blaming drunken rage or a robbery gone wrong until they noticed something strange. The back door had been chiseled open, the wood splintered carefully. Quietly, a panel had been removed with unnatural precision, not smashed. Whoever came in did not want to wake the sleeping couple until it was too late. Then there was the axe, not abandoned in the street, not carried by the killer. It belonged to the Maggio family. Whoever did this had gone outside, picked up Joseph's own axe from the shed, and carried it back inside like a surgeon selecting his instrument. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, no neighbors heard anything, even stranger. Nothing was stolen. It was not a robbery. It was a message. Yet at the time, the city did not understand what was coming. It treated the murders like an isolated tragedy. But fear travels quietly at first. The whispers began. Someone is out there. Someone is watching us sleep. Someone is choosing houses. Before the coroner's report was even finished, another detail spread through the city like sickness. Near the couple's bed, written in chalk on the wall, were strange words, not a complete sentence, not clear enough to decipher fully. Police erased it before reporters arrived. Some said it mentioned a man named Joseph. Others said it referenced a jazz song. Some swore it was a threat. But what mattered was not what it said. What mattered was that it was written inside the house. People began locking their doors at night. But doors meant nothing. 2 months later, another scream ripped through the night. This time it came from the lower part of the city where the docks smelled of fish and the fog rolled in thick from the river. A couple, Louis and Anna, were found nearly dead. Once again, the back door had been chiseled open. Once again, the family's own axe had been lifted from the yard and used with uncanny brutality. Louis survived. Barely. Anna drifted between life and death for 3 days before passing. Louis claimed he remembered seeing a shadow at the foot of the bed. A tall man, thin, with shoulders that moved strangely, almost hunched. But he admitted he wasn't sure if that was real or a nightmare forming around the pain. What terrified the city more was this. Anna had been struck so violently that pieces of bone were found lodged in the wall. Still, police insisted it was connected to Italian family disputes, or drunken brawls, or jealous lovers. Anything was better than admitting what the people already felt in their bones, that something was moving through the city at night. Something human yet not human in its silence, its precision, its hunger. The summer heat deepened. Mosquitoes multiplied. Jazz drifted from smoky bars into the streets. But the joy of the city's heartbeat of its nightlife began to pulsate unevenly. People stayed home more. They watched their windows. They whispered to friends in low voices. Have you heard? There was another. By August, children were told to stay indoors after sunset. Dogs began barking at empty alleys. Families slept with knives under pillows, though none of them believed it would help. And then, just as the fear began to feel stale and almost manageable. The killer resurfaced in a way that shattered the city's last illusion of safety. It was early morning when neighbors heard a young woman screaming from a house on Jefferson Avenue. When they burst inside, they found her staggering, drenched in blood, clutching her newborn baby tightly to her chest. Her husband lay on the floor unconscious, a massive gash carved across his face. The room looked like a butcher shop. The back door, chiseled open. The weapon, their own axe. The woman, somehow still lucid despite the blood loss, pointed toward the door as if she had seen something real. Something living. Something standing in the shadows of her home. But when the police asked her to describe him, she broke into sobs so violent that she couldn't speak. Another unsolved attack. Another house chosen at random. Another family destroyed. And yet this time, something new was found. A pile of discarded clothes in the alley behind the house. Clean clothes, folded neatly. A shirt, trousers, a hat, as if the killer had changed before walking into the street. Like a predator slipping back into the skin of a normal man. Rumors blossomed instantly. Some believed the killer dressed like an ordinary laborer to blend in. Others believed he stripped off his blood-stained clothes and walked bare-chested into the night like an animal returning to the wilderness. Children whispered that he changed shape, that he was a demon wearing a man's body. For the first time, the newspapers used a name that would ignite the city's nightmares. The Axeman. Once the name appeared in print, it spread like wildfire. The Axeman stalks again. Who will he strike next? Is the Axeman among us? Fear became entertainment. Entertainment fueled fear. Bars filled with anxious conversations. Churches filled with trembling prayers. Housewives demanded their husbands stay home. Husbands sat up all night with lamps burning. Doors barricaded. Guns loaded. But the Axeman was not deterred by locked doors or vigilant eyes. He moved like smoke through cracks in windows. He slipped between walls. He stepped over sleeping bodies without waking them. The city felt possessed. The police eventually formed a special unit to investigate the killings. But they worked in circles. They questioned Italian immigrants, rival shopkeepers, former lovers, criminals, drifters, anyone who fit the shape of suspicion. None of them fit the silence, the technique, the unnatural calm of the killer. Meanwhile, witnesses reported odd sightings. A tall man slipping across rooftops at night. A figure crouching in an alley behind a butcher shop. A man standing perfectly still under a street lamp at 2 in the morning. Head tilted as if listening. A slim silhouette watching people through windows but vanishing before anyone could approach. Most sightings proved false. But the city felt hunted. Watched. Studied. Then, in the fading months of 1918, the influenza pandemic swept across the region. Hospitals overflowed. Coffins lined the streets. Children cried behind shut doors. The whole city seemed to tremble between sickness and terror. And that was when the Axeman struck again. Late November. Rain hammered the roofs. A storm turned the river into a dark, churning monster. In the French Quarter, where drunken laughter usually rolled down the cobblestone streets, silence spread instead, thick, suffocating silence. Inside a small home near Rampart Street, a man named Joseph Romano was found with his head split open. Neighbors heard the crash of glass and the sound of heavy footsteps fleeing into the rain. Romano lived long enough to mutter a description. The man he saw wore a dark suit and slouched hat, and his whispered his eyes glowed like they were lit from inside. The city exploded. Sightings multiplied overnight. Every street corner had a shadow. Every alley seemed to breathe. Newspapers printed sensational headlines. Preachers called it a punishment from God. Jazz musicians wrote songs about him, their notes trembling with a strange blend of fear and fascination. People claimed the Axeman could not be human. How could he walk so silently? How could he break into homes without waking a soul? How could he disappear without leaving tracks? How could he choose victims seemingly at random, yet strike with such confidence? One theory said he was a butcher with surgical skill. Another claimed he was a vagrant who lived underground in the old drainage tunnels beneath the city. Others whispered he was a spirit, something old, lurking in the swamp long before humans came. But no one could agree. A man was arrested for Romano's murder, but witnesses quickly proved he wasn't there. With every failed arrest, the city's trust in the police collapsed. Citizens began forming their own night watches, patrolling streets with lanterns and shotguns. Men carried pistols to church. Women slept with kitchen knives under their pillows. People hammered iron bars across windows. Doors were nailed shut from the inside. But everyone knew the truth. No hammer, no lock, no weapon could stop someone who moved like a whisper. The Axeman was choosing his moments, watching, waiting, and the city of New Orleans, trapped in the grip of disease, poverty, war, and superstition, felt its heartbeat falter under his gaze. Eventually, even the bravest men refused to walk alone at night. A rumor spread that the Axeman was seen dancing outside a speakeasy after midnight. Someone else claimed he was spotted sitting calmly on a church step, humming to himself. A third person swore that as they walked past a darkened house, they saw a shadow tilt its head toward them slowly. As if smiling, the city had become a living stage for terror, and the killer was its invisible conductor. Winter arrived, cold by New Orleans standards, but the Axeman did not sleep. He watched homes decorated for Christmas. He watched families gather around small fires. He watched from windows, from alleys, from rooftops. The Italian community believed he was specifically targeting them. Shopkeepers whispered in their native tongue, crossing themselves, praying for protection. And the strangest part was this. The Axeman seemed to enjoy the fear. Each attack escalated the hysteria. He made no demands. He stole nothing. He left no message. His purpose was not wealth, revenge, lust, or rage. It was something darker. He wanted the city to tremble. And by the time the new year approached, New Orleans had become a city that barely dared to breathe after sunset. Doors were never left unlocked. Windows were never opened. Everyone slept lightly, waking at every sound, every creak, every shift in the wind, because they all understood the same truth. The Axeman was still out there, and he was far from finished. The winter of 1919 crept over New Orleans with a strange quietness, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The cold was mild, but the fear wasn't. It sat inside homes like a fourth family member, silent and uninvited. People moved slower, spoke softer, and every night the streets emptied long before midnight. Music still drifted from bars and dance halls, but even jazz sounded nervous during those months. Pianos were played a little too fast, trumpets a little too loud, as if the musicians were trying to drown out something lurking right outside the door. For a time, the Axeman seemed to vanish, and some dared to hope that perhaps the killer had died, been arrested under a false name, fled the city, or simply grown tired of the game. But others knew better. Evil that deliberate does not stop. It waits, it watches, and like the humidity in the summer months, it returns the moment you let your guard down. The hope shattered on a cold March night when a woman named Rose heard footsteps echoing across her hallway. She opened her eyes, unsure whether the sound was part of a dream or something real. Her husband was asleep beside her, breathing heavily. She listened again. There it was, slow, careful, dragging footsteps, like someone learning how to walk for the first time. She sat up. The house was dark, and the quiet pressed against her eardrums so tightly she could hear her own heartbeat. She shook her husband awake. Before he could move, before either of them took another breath, the door to their bedroom creaked open. Just a few inches. Just enough. A long shadow fell across the floor, and then the axe swung. Her scream tore through the walls like a blade of sound, and neighbors would later describe it as a sound that froze the blood before the brain could react. Her husband stumbled from the bed, hands clutching his bleeding head. Rose collapsed. The side of her face split open. Their infant child, only months old, lay in a cradle nearby, crying as blood splattered across the sheets. The killer slipped out the back door before neighbors even reached the porch. Once again, the panel of the door had been carefully removed. Once again, the family's own axe had been used. Once again, no valuables were taken, no motive discovered. No trace left behind. This time, Rose survived. Her face was permanently scarred, but she lived long enough to describe the figure she glimpsed in the doorway. Tall, very tall, shoulders narrow, almost hunched forward, as if the man were leaning into the darkness itself. But the detail that chilled the detectives was this. She insisted the eyes of the silhouette did not reflect the light they absorbed it. After that attack, panic ignited like wildfire. The newspapers printed warnings on every front page. People hammered boards across their windows. Locksmiths made more money in a month than they had in a year. Men patrolled the streets with lanterns and rifles, walking in groups of 3 or 4 because no man wanted to be alone after midnight. The police commissioner held a press conference, his hands shaking as he promised new measures of protection. He announced they had suspects, but no arrests came, no breakthroughs. Every lead dissolved into nothing. The streets emptied. But fear does not stay quiet in a city like New Orleans. It crawled through the cracks of its buildings and slithered under the doors. It whispered through the oak trees, through the iron gates of old cemeteries, through the bars that once echoed with music and laughter. At the same time, rumors grew louder. Some insisted the Axeman was a butcher who worked near the French market. Others believed he was a dock worker who blended into the crowds on the riverfront during the day. A few whispered he was a former priest turned madman, or a soldier returned from the war with broken memories and a thirst for blood. But the most unsettling rumor came from the older Creole families, those who remembered stories from long before the American flag flew over the city. They whispered that the Axeman was not new, but something old, something that fed on fear, something that moved through generations of the city's history, choosing its moments to reappear. These rumors didn't reach the police, but they spread through the homes of the French Quarter like smoke. And people listened. Because when logic fails, imagination fills the void. The Axeman attacked again in early March, in the home of Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia, grocers who lived in the small town of Gretna. Just across the river, it was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where children played in the dirt streets and neighbors waved from their porches. But quiet neighborhoods are the easiest to break. Late one night, Rosie awoke to the sound of wood splintering. She thought at first it was the shutters rattling. Then she heard footsteps slow, deliberate, impossibly controlled. She sat up and reached for her husband. But before she could wake him, the Axeman towered over their bed like a silhouette of death. Charles tried to fight back. He lunged out of bed, grappling with the figure, shouting for Rosie to run. But the killer moved with an unnatural strength, striking Charles in the head with a blow so hard it cracked the bone beneath the scalp. Rosie grabbed their 2-year-old daughter, Mary, clutching her to her chest as she fled the room. But the Axeman was faster. He caught Rosie before she reached the back door. The axe fell once, twice. She collapsed, barely conscious, and the child rolled from her arms onto the floor. Mary lay still, blood pooling beneath her. Neighbors later described Rosie wandering into the street, stumbling, screaming her daughter's name, her face drenched in blood, her nightgown torn. She collapsed on a neighbor's porch, trembling so violently she could not speak until morning. The Cortimiglia's daughter died at the scene. Charles survived, though permanently scarred. Rosie lived, but something inside her broke that night. A fracture deeper than bone. Her memory blurred. Her mind twisted under the weight of grief. She accused neighbors. Francenianito makes sense of the senseless. Eventually, she rescinded her accusations. But the damage had been done. Innocent people had been convicted, and the real killer continued walking free. This attack shook the city more violently than the others. And for one chilling reason. It happened outside New Orleans. The Axeman was no longer confined to the city. He was mobile. He could strike anywhere, at any time. He could cross the river, vanish into the woods, or slip between towns like a phantom passing through walls. People realized there was nowhere to hide. As fear peaked, the Axeman did something no killer had ever done in the history of the city. He wrote a letter. It arrived at the office of the Times-Picayune several days after the Cortimiglia attack. The envelope had no return address, no fingerprints, no clues. Inside was a handwritten letter filled with strange, taunting, almost theatrical language. But what horrified the city was not the stylate, was the content. He claimed he was no mere human killer. He said he came from hell, that he was a demon, that he answered to Satan himself. He described himself as a spirit who could not be caught, who laughed at the attempts to stop him. He said that the police would never find him because they were looking for a man and he was something more. But the most infamous part of the letter was this: I am fond of jazz music. On the night of Tuesday, March 19th, I will pass over New Orleans. I will spare every house where a jazz band is playing. But if anyone dares to spend the night in silence, they will earn my axe. The city erupted. No one knew whether the letter was real, whether it truly came from the killer or some deranged imitator. But fear does not ask for proof. It obeys instinct. On the night of March 19th, 1919, New Orleans transformed into something the world had never seen. Every bar, every restaurant, every home blasted music into the streets. Jazz bands played on balconies, in alleys, in living rooms. Pianos thundered, trumpets screamed. People who had never played an instrument in their lives pounded pots, rattled pans, banged on furniture, anything to make noise. The city, for one night, became an orchestra of terror. And somewhere in those streets, in the shadows between the lamplights, someone walked, a tall figure, moving slowly, calmly, listening to the music, watching the city obey him. No one died that night. The next morning, the city was exhausted. People collapsed into chairs and beds after dawn, breathless with relief. But underneath it all lurked a deeper fear of a killer who could control an entire city with a single demand. The police publicly dismissed the letter as a prank, but privately they were not so sure. The handwriting matched no known suspect. The language was unlike any letter from serial criminals of the time. And the timing just days after the Corte Miglia murder was too convenient. That night changed the city forever. New Orleans became divided between people who believed the Axeman was simply a murderer with a flair for theatrics, and those who believed the older, darker rumors, those who believed he walked among them, disguised as an ordinary man, and those who believed he was something else entirely. The attacks slowed after the jazz night, but the fear didn't. To many, it felt as if the Axeman had shifted into another phase. Another patternless, predictable, more deliberate. Windows were barred permanently, doors reinforced. Men stayed awake through the night, pacing their living rooms, rifles in hand. Children slept in their parents' beds. Jazz clubs, ironically, filled with new business, people seeking safety and sound. Even the weather seemed to reflect the city's dread. Spring storms blasted through the streets, tearing shingles from roofs, filling gutters with muddy water. Thunder shook the windows. Lightning illuminated the old iron balconies, casting sharp shadows across the fog. On nights like those, the city felt abandoned by God. Then, just when the city began to feel the faintest sense of distance from the terror, just when the memory of the last attack began to soften, another murder shattered the illusion. It happened in August. The victim was an elderly woman named Sarah, who lived alone in a quiet neighborhood not far from the river. She was known for her kindness, her warm bread, and her laughter that carried through the block. She was the type of woman no one could imagine being harmed. But imagination is powerless against the will of evil. Her body was found by neighbors who noticed her front door slightly open. Inside, the house was eerily undisturbed. A loaf of bread rested on the counter. A kettle sat cooling on the stove. A single chair had been pulled out from the table, as if someone had sat there in contemplation before rising quietly. Sarah lay in her bed, her skull crushed. The sheets were soaked with blood. And, as always, the weapon was her own axe. But this time, there was a detail more chilling than any before. The back door had not been forced, not chiseled, not removed panel by panel. It had been unlocked. Detectives believed she had opened the door willingly. Maybe she had heard a noise and gone to investigate, thinking a neighbor needed help. Maybe she believed the figure outside was someone she knew. Maybe she had seen the Axeman before, in daylight, dressed as someone familiar, or perhaps in this idea spread like lightning she'd heard music. A faint tune, a melody played outside her window, just soft enough for her to follow it. Whatever happened, she let him in, and he rewarded her trust with death. The murder reignited the panic. But this time, the fear felt different. Before, the Axeman had attacked in bursts, like a storm that rolled in, crashed, and moved on. But after Sarah's death, people felt something had changed. Some said the killer was becoming more confident, more secure in his invisibility. Others believed the attacks were becoming ritualistic, tied to something beyond human understanding. The police worked tirelessly, interrogating anyone who matched even the vaguest description. But descriptions varied wildly. Some said he was tall, others said medium height. Some saw a slouching figure, others saw a man standing perfectly straight. Some claimed his eyes glowed, others claimed his eyes were dark pits. It was as if people were describing different men, or one man who changed shape, or a shadow that reflected whatever the witness feared most. Regardless of the truth, New Orleans had entered the darkest chapter of its history. A killer walked freely among its people, choosing homes at random, slipping silently through the night, leaving devastation behind him. And somewhere in the city, beneath the confusion, beneath the fear, a deeper truth pulsed. The Axeman was not done. He had merely paused, waiting for the next moment to strike, studying the city like a hunter watching prey that had grown too still. The next attack would not simply terrify New Orleans. It would break something inside the city that would never fully mend. The months after Sarah's murder passed in a tense stillness. Like the city was frozen between breaths, New Orleans had learned to live with fear, to weave it into everyday life like thread through fabric. But over time, fear takes on different shapes. It becomes routine, then irritation, then decay. People tried to return to their lives, though what they returned to was only a shell of what the city used to be. Streetcars clattered through foggy mornings, but the usual friendly chatter had disappeared. The markets near the French quarters still opened at dawn, but customers lingered nervously instead of gossiping. Even the jazz hallways overflowing with rhythm and life felt haunted by an audience that listened with one ear and listened for footsteps with the other. But it was the silences between the jazz notes that frightened people most. Silence had become the sound of danger. Silence meant the Axeman could be near. Silence meant something could slip through a door hinge, a crack in a window, the breathing darkness of a hallway. The city waited for his next move. When it didn't come, paranoia took on a new life. Everyone began suspecting everyone else. Wives questioned their husbands. Husbands eyed strangers on the street. Children whispered rumors at school that their teachers were secretly the Axeman in disguise. Rumors spiraled in the markets, the bars, the factories. People pointed fingers at butchers, musicians, foreigners, policemen, even priests. But fear creates shadows where none exist. The truth was simpler and far more horrifying. The Axeman was quiet because he wanted to be. He was choosing his moment. He was listening to the city's heartbeat slow down after months of chaos. He wanted to strike when they had finally begun to forget. And so, he waited. Spring of 1919 arrived with storms thick as wet wool. Rain fell almost daily, leaving the streets slick and the gutters overflowing. Lightning carved jagged scars across the sky. Thunder rattled the shutters of old houses that had barely survived previous hurricanes. On nights when the storms were heavy, people locked their doors and prayed that rain would drown the footsteps of any monster lurking outside. But storms can provide cover. Darkness can provide opportunity. And the Axeman had always moved best when the world around him was asleep or screaming. It was on such a night a storm heavy enough to drown out screams when he returned. The house belonged to a young woman named Esther. She lived alone, a seamstress who had moved into the city after her husband died of influenza. Her neighbors adored her. She often left small gifts on their porches, mended clothes for free, or brought bread to older widows who had difficulty leaving their homes. She was gentle, hopeful, the kind of woman who still believed in goodness even in a city bruised by terror. Rain hammered her windows that night as she worked by lamplight. sewing the hem of a dress for a customer. The wind howled, and branches slapped against the house. But she barely noticed. She was humming a tune soft, almost lullaby-like to distract herself from the storm. Around midnight, she stood and stretched, preparing to blow out the lamp. She paused before doing so. A feeling crept into her chest, faint but undeniable, like she was being watched. The hairs on her neck prickled. She stepped to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Nothing but rain. She laughed nervously, chastising herself for letting the Axeman linger in her imagination. She fastened the latch on the window, blew out the lamp, and went to bed, listening to the rain lash the roof like 1,000 fingertips. She never heard the chisel. Neighbors later said the storm masked everything, that thunder swallowed the slow, careful scraping of wood being removed from her back door. But sound was not what mattered. What mattered was intent. And the intent that crept into Esther's home that night was colder than the rain outside. The killer moved through her home like a ghost. He picked up her own axe from the shed. He entered her bedroom and watched her sleep. Watched the rise and fall of her chest. Studied the rhythm of her breath. Some believed later that he waited several minutes before striking. Savoring the stillness, the storm outside exploded with thunder as the axe fell. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky was painfully bright. Birds chirped, oblivious to the nightmare inside the small house. A neighbor bringing Esther fresh bread found the door open. The wood around the frame splintered in a way that felt familiar. The crime scene was worse than any before. The axe had been swung with a violence that suggested rage, but that was the strange part. The Axeman was not a killer driven by rage. He had always been calm, controlled, deliberate. But Esther's murder was different. It was excessive, brutal even by his standards. Her bed was soaked with blood. The walls were speckled with dark stains. Her body was barely recognizable. The coroner later said her skull had been shattered like porcelain, a detail that made some detectives believe the killer had lost control for the first time. But one detail chilled the police more than anything else. In the corner of the room, on the floor, someone had placed one of Esther's sewing needles, balanced perfectly upright. A detail so precise, so strange, no one could explain what it meant. A ritual, a signature, a psychological message. No one knew. Some thought perhaps the killer had watched her sew earlier through the window, admiring the delicate precision, and wanted to mimic her in his own twisted way. Others thought the needle was a warning. Everything in the house, every tool, every object belonged to him once he entered. The newspapers exploded with panic. The Axeman returns. Another innocent slain. Is anyone safe? But the public had grown numb to fear. Instead of shock, a quiet despair seeped through the city. People were beginning to understand that the Axeman could not be predicted, stopped, or reasoned with. He was like the storm, simply something that happened. But the police refused to surrender. Detectives interrogated hundreds of suspect stock workers, traveling musicians, butchers, drifters, bar owners, men who lived alone, men who had suspicious cuts on their hands, men whose wives said they'd acted strangely. They even jailed some innocent men for weeks at a time because any action, even wrongful, felt better than helplessness. Still, nothing pointed to a real suspect. Meanwhile, something else stirred deep in the city's cultural heart. Jazz, the music that had once been the lifeblood of the city, was now deeply entangled with its fear. Musicians debated whether the Axeman's letter had been a prank or a true message from the killer. Some claimed the killer had a strong connection to jazz culture, that he visited clubs, that he knew musicians, that he respected them in some twisted way. Others believed the Axeman was a musician himself. After all, who else could move so gracefully, so rhythmically? Who else could slip through the city's nights unnoticed? Who else could claim to love jazz in a way that felt more like reverence than mockery? Some bandleaders secretly wondered if they had played for him the real Axeman that night when the city erupted with music. Maybe he had stood in the corner of a club, disguised as a tired worker, silently keeping time with the beat. Maybe he had drifted among the crowds like a spectator, enjoying his own power. These thoughts infected the jazz scene like a whispering plague. Musicians played harder, louder, trying to fill the space with sound because silence now felt like a curse. But deep down, they knew the truth. Music could distract the Axeman, but it could not stop him. The police decided they needed help from outside New Orleans. Detectives traveled to other cities, studying similar crimes. They discovered several unsolved axe murders in Texas, Kentucky, and Mississippi. Families slaughtered in their sleep. Doors chiseled open. No motive. No theft. The weapon often belonged to the victim. A chilling possibility emerged. The Axeman had not been born in New Orleans. He had traveled. He had practiced elsewhere. Perhaps he had been killing for years before arriving in the city. Or perhaps he was part of a wandering group of killers, each following the same ritual. But these theories did nothing to calm the city. If anything, they deepened the terror. Because if he was a traveler, then he could leave anytime and return whenever he wished. And then, in late summer, the Axeman disappeared again. Weeks passed, then months. The city slowly exhaled, but the breath felt poisoned. People laughed again, but their laughs were hollow. Jazz clubs reopened fully, but the shadows behind the stage seemed darker. The police maintained patrols at night, but fewer men volunteered as the memory of the attacks faded into a nightmare people preferred not to revisit. But memory is not protection, and forgetting is the most dangerous thing a city can do while a predator waits nearby. The Axeman returned on a night so normal that its ordinariness became its cruelty. The victim was an older man named Henry, who worked as a carpenter. His neighbors thought of him as a kind, quiet man, always willing to help repair a fence or fix a door. He lived alone, having lost his wife years earlier. He had no enemies, no debts, no troubles anyone knew of. That night, Henry sat at his small kitchen table eating a simple meal: bread, cheese, a slice of ham while the radio played quietly. He hummed along, tapping his fingers against the table. Outside, the street lamp flickered, casting trembling shadows across his windows. When he finished his meal, he washed the dishes and hung his towel neatly. He locked his door and checked it twice, as everyone in the city had learned to do. Then he walked to his bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his tired hands. He glanced toward the corner of the room where his late wife's photograph sat on the dresser. Then came the noise, a soft crack. At first he thought it was the house settling, but then he heard it again, a low scraping sound. Delicate, deliberate, wood against metal. Henry stood, reaching for the lamp. His hands trembled as he lit it, casting a warm glow across the room. And then he saw it. The panel in his back door had been removed. The frame hung open like a broken jaw. A figure stepped inside, tall, silent, gliding through the darkness with a stillness that felt impossible. Henry froze, unable to speak or scream. The figure raised the axe. Henry's Axeman stepped closer. Henry stumbled backward, knocking over the lamp. The room plunged into darkness. Neighbors later said they heard nothing. Not a scream, not a crash, not a cry for help. When they entered Henry's house the next morning, they found him lying on the floor beside his bed. His head split open. The room smelled faintly of smoke from the lamp's broken wick. But there was something else, a detail that became the most chilling part of the crime. On the table beside his body rested a small, handmade wooden cross. A cross Henry did not make. A cross no one recognized. The Axeman had left it behind. Some interpreted the cross as a taunt, a mockery of the city's prayers. Others believed it was a message. He decided who lived and who died, not God. Others insisted it was a ritual object, proof that the killer was performing some kind of spiritual or symbolic act. Whatever the meaning, the cross confirmed what many already feared. The Axeman was evolving, becoming more expressive, more theatrical, more intertwined with the city's psyche. After Henry's murder, the Axeman once again vanished. Not for weeks, time for months. People began to believe the spree was truly over, that perhaps the killer had died, or been arrested for a different crime, or fled the city forever. But the Axeman was not gone. He was waiting, watching, allowing the city to lower its guard. allowing doors to remain unlocked again, allowing people to sleep through the night without fear, allowing musicians to play jazz for pleasure instead of survival. He was studying the city's heartbeat, waiting for the perfect moment to strike one final time. The next attack would not simply shock New Orleans, it would become the darkest, most disturbing crime of the year. A murder so brutal it would leave the city permanently scarred. And when it came, it would reveal something new about the Axeman, something the city was never prepared to face. As autumn rolled into 1919, New Orleans felt strangely lighter. The humidity dropped, the evenings turned cooler, and the oppressive tension that had smothered the city for months began to thin. People dared to breathe again, dared to laugh again, dared to walk through the French Quarter at dusk without constantly looking over their shoulders. Children returned to playing in the streets. Families reopened windows at night to let in the fresh air. Jazz once again spilled into the streets without the tremor of desperation behind it. People did not forget the Axeman, but they slowly allowed him to sink into memory. Fear has limits. People cannot live in terror indefinitely. And so the city slowly exhaled, whispering to itself that perhaps the nightmare had passed, that perhaps the killer had moved on, or perhaps been swallowed by the swamps that surrounded the city like ancient guardians. But danger thrives in complacency, for while the city slept more easily, the Axeman did not sleep at all. He was waiting, biding his time, letting the city's vigilance dissolve into soft comfort, like a hunter who knows that prey must eventually lower its guard, like a shadow that grows longer when the sun begins to set. And then, on a cold October morning, the screams returned. It was nearly dawn when a man named James, a milk delivery driver, approached the home of Mike Pepitone. The house stood on a quiet residential street, where most homes was still dark, but something about the Pepitone house felt wrong immediately. The door was open. Light flickered inside. James stepped closer, calling out softly. When no one answered, he pushed the door open and stumbled backward, dropping his milk bottles, as shards of glass shattered across the steps. Inside, the scene was a nightmare. The walls were drenched in blood, not splattered soaked, as if someone had taken buckets of it and thrown it with violent force. It dripped down the wallpaper, pooled on the floor, clung to the furniture. It was the kind of sight that did not seem possible for a single body to produce. But it had. Pepitone lay face down on the floor, his skull smashed with such aggression that the bone had fractured into shards. Near him, a religious painting gone depicting St. Michael slaying a demon hung crooked on the wall, now smeared with bloody streaks that distorted the angel's face. But what terrified the police most was not the brutality of the attack. It was the fact that Pepitone's wife had been in the house the entire time. She was found in the corner of the bedroom, clutching a rosary so tightly that the beads had cut into her palms. She was trembling violently, unable to speak for hours. When she finally did, her words were barely audible. She said she had awakened to the sound of shattering glass, walked into the hallway, and seen a figure at all, broad-shouldered, wearing a slouched hat standing over her husband as he struck him again and again. Then the figure turned. She could not see his face clearly, but she insisted there was something wrong with it, something blurred, something misshapen, as if the shadows themselves wrapped around him. He fled before she could scream, and with him, he took the last illusions of normalcy the city had been clinging to. Pepitone's murder was the most savage of all the Axeman's crimes. More violent, more chaotic, as though the killer's restraint had finally snapped. And yet something about it felt purposeful. The painting, the timing, the silence of the house until the final blow. It was as if the Axeman had been waiting for this moment, building toward it, like the final note of a song he had been composing all year. This was his finale. The city erupted once again into panic. But this time the fear had a different tone. It was not the frantic terror of earlier attacks. It was a hollow, exhausted dread. People realized the truth they had been denying for months. The Axeman could come back at any time. He could vanish for months, return without warning, kill again, and disappear like smoke. Some residents fled the city entirely. Others barricaded their homes beyond recognition. Men formed night watch groups. Though many suspected they would crumble the moment they actually encountered the Axeman. Priests held masses specifically praying against demonic influence. Voodoo practitioners burned protective herbs and placed charms on their doors. Musicians wrote new songs, darker ones, haunted by the killer who had once demanded a night of jazz. But none of it brought answers. Pepitone's murder left no clues. The back door had been forced open in the same familiar way. The family axe was missing, presumed to have been taken by the killer. There was no sign of forced entry beyond that. No fingerprints, no boot prints, no motive, no pattern beyond cruelty. The police were left once again with theories, suspicions, and dead ends. But in the weeks following the murder, something strange began to happen. Sightings, not the panicked, contradictory sightings of earlier months. These were different, more consistent, more focused. Residents claimed to see a tall man in a dark hat walking alone on the levee late at night. Others said they noticed a figure sitting on benches near the cemeteries, staring at the tombs long after midnight. A few musicians swore they'd seen the Axeman in their clubs quiet, solitary, listening intently to the music. One bartender said a man with cold, glassy eyes had sat at the end of the bar the week before Pepitone's murder, tapping his fingers against a glass in sync with the piano. When the bartender tried to make conversation, the man simply stared at him, then slipped out into the night without a word. But these were only fragments. The truth remained elusive. Then, just as abruptly as he had returned, the Axeman disappeared again. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The year turned. New Orleans began to heal, though the scars ran deep. Pepitone's widow eventually left the city, unable to remain in the house where her life had shattered. Some say she moved west. Others claim she vanished into the swamps. Still others whispered that she sought vengeance, an idea that would later grow into one of the strangest subplots of the case's long shadow. But the Axeman himself was gone. And this time, he never came back. No more attacks followed. No more letters. No more chiseled doors or stolen axes. No suspect was ever arrested. No deathbed confession ever surfaced. No drifter caught for another crime ever admitted to the killings. The trail went cold. So cold that even the most dedicated detectives eventually gave up. But while the attacks stopped, the fear did not. People struggled to accept that something so brutal could end without explanation. Rumors grew into legends. Theories multiplied like shadows in dim light. Some believed the Axeman had died of influenza. Others thought he'd been arrested under a false name in another state. Some believed he left the country entirely. But others, those who remembered the old stories, the whispered Creole folklore, believed something darker, that the Axeman had never been a single man at all. They believed he was a presence, a shape, a hunger that moved through time, a manifestation of rage, violence, and fear, something that fed on the city's darkest moments, appearing when the conditions were right, vanishing when he'd taken what he needed. Stories grew of a figure who had haunted New Orleans long before the newspapers named him. Sightings of similar killings decades earlier. Tales of men who heard footsteps in their hallways during the Civil War. Legends of a shadowed figure that visited homes during yellow fever outbreaks. A demon that walked the line between man and myth. A creature that slipped into rooms when death was near. Whether people believed in the supernatural or not, one truth remained. The Axeman was never caught. The police reports were eventually boxed and stored, collected under a single ominous category. Over time, papers yellowed, edges crumbled, and memories faded. But the stories survived, passed from families to children, from musicians to listeners, from storytellers to audiences, and the city itself so vibrant, so haunted, remembered. Decades later, on hot summer nights when the air hung heavy and oppressive, older residents swore they could still feel a presence if they walked alone on quiet streets. A prickling sensation behind the neck. A shadow that didn't move quite right. The faintest sound of scraping, like wood being chiseled. Jazz musicians sometimes told tales after their sets, claiming that they had once looked out into the audience and seen a man in a dark hat watching them with unnatural stillness. When they finished playing, the man was always gone. Children growing up near the old neighborhoods spoke of nightmares in which a tall figure entered their rooms silently, his hat hiding his face, his hands gripping an axe that glimmered in moonlight. Parents dismissed these nightmares as imagination, but they whispered among themselves that their grandparents had described the same dreams. And every so often, someone in the city would claim to hear footsteps late at night, slow, deliberate, dragging ever so slightly. They always checked their doors. They always checked their windows. And they always made sure music was playing just in case. For even though the Axeman vanished, the city never forgot the night he took control of New Orleans through fear alone. The night when jazz became protection. The night when silence carried death in its wake. In the years after the murders, some writers described the Axeman as a phantom killer. Others called him America's first musical madman. Some believed he was simply a product of chaos, a murderer who exploited the city's vulnerability during war, disease, and poverty. Others argued he was something more complex, more intelligent, more calculating. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. The Axeman was a man who understood power. He understood fear the way musicians understand rhythm. He knew how to let silence linger, when to strike, when to vanish, when to let the city whip itself into hysteria. He understood how people think, how they sleep, how they let their guard down. He knew that the anticipation of terror is often worse than terror itself. And he knew exactly when to walk away when his legend was strong enough to do the rest of the work for him. In this way, the Axeman achieved something far darker than murder. He became eternal, long after his axe stopped swinging, long after his footsteps faded, long after the doors of New Orleans stopped being chiseled open in the dead of night. He remained alive in the collective memory of the city, not as flesh and blood, but as a warning, a whisper in the dark, a shadow at the foot of a bed, a presence behind a window pane, a soft scrape that should not exist. For in New Orleans, even today, people say this: there are two kinds of nights here, nights filled with music, and nights filled with silence. And on the nights filled with silence, if you listen carefully, you might still hear him, the footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer.